Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm taking a look at the BetaFPV Meteor65 with their new BT2 connector. Now it's been a while since I've flown a 65mm whoop because all of my 1S lipos that are a suitable size for a 65mm whoop lasted around 10 cycles before they inflated like a balloon and couldn't be used anymore. But BetaFPV thinks they have a solution for this with their BT2 connector. Now most whoops use PH2 connectors, but they are only rated for 2 amps and in reality can be pushed to about 10 amps. However, this causes a resistance, so when you arm the model, the voltage instantly drops to a value where you should be landing. But of course we carry on flying. In fact, most of these models come with their voltage warning set to 2.9 volts. But if a LiPo is pushed past 3.3 volts, then the polymer starts to break down into its individual components. The term polymer is just a word to describe the mixing of things. So in the case of a LiPo, its main chemicals are lithium and oxygen. And even if you look after your LiPos, these chemicals still break down over time. But if you overcharge or over discharge them, then this chemical breakdown happens more quickly. The puffing comes from the release of oxygen in the polymer, and lithium oxide forms around the anode and cathode, rendering the LiPo useless and also quite dangerous. Now the PH2 connector definitely plays a part in that, but if it's the only contributing factor, then why are all of my 450 milliamp Tiny Hawk batteries not puffed after a year or so and still give great performance despite having a PH2 connector? Well, it's because the connector is not the only problem with these small models. A larger capacity LiPo can provide more current than a smaller capacity LiPo because its C rating or discharge rate is a multiple of its capacity. Now, it's rare that a C rating written on the side of a LiPo is accurate. On the BetaFPV LiPo, it says 30 to 60 C, which is 30 or 60 times the current of 300 milliamps. So that's either 9 amps or 18 amps. But if we look at the Tiny Hawk battery, its discharge rate is listed as 80C to 160C, which is obviously a nonsense number, especially when the PH2 connector is only good enough for 10 amps. But for argument's sake, let's say the C rating is the same as the BetaFPV LiPo. So 30 times the capacity of 450 milliamps is 13.5 amps, and 60 times the capacity is 27 amps. But what's significant about the Tiny Hawk battery is that it's powering a bigger model with larger props and lower kV motors, and I think by accident that combination just works. The LiPo's capacity and discharge rate is proportional to the current draw from the Tiny Hawk, meaning that the resistance of the PH2 connector isn't so much of a problem. So I don't think the 65mm size model can ever win when it comes to LiPos because the props and motors are always going to be too small to carry a big enough LiPo. And then when the resistance of the PH2 connector is taken away, it opens up the floodgates for these tiny 802 22,000 kV motors to draw more current. So there will be a lot more power, but I think more power will cause the LiPo's voltage to sag and also produce really short flight times, because we saw it in the 5-inch world. Ever since 5-inch motors went past the 2206 stator size, 1300 milliamp 4S LiPos would sag to damaging numbers because we were asking for too much current. So I switched to a 1500 milliamp 4S LiPo. Then when 2306 and 24 stator motors came into place, there was even more current demand, so we had to switch to 6S because it was the only way to reduce the current draw and reduce voltage sag. But the problem with 65mm models is that we can't just put a bigger battery on it because they rely on being small and light. So I think this BT2 connector for this size of model is still going to result in ballooned LiPos very quickly. But I'll let the flight test put that theory through its paces later. So let's talk more about the model. Its dry weight is 23 grams, and with the 300 milliamp LiPo, its all-up weight is 30 grams. You're given 2 LiPos and 2 BT2 adapters so that you can use a PH2 charger to charge the LiPos up. They are a high volt, but as I said earlier, overcharging LiPos is as bad as over-discharging them, and there's nothing special in a high volt LiPo other than the fact that they have high volt written on the side. But to stress these batteries for the sake of this review, I'll be charging them to a high volt. You don't get given a charger in the package, so you'll need to source one yourself. I'll put a link in the description of this video to the one that I use. In the box, you are given a spare BT2 connector if for some reason this one breaks or you decide that you want to add one to another model, along with a second camera mount. One is set at a high angle for racing and the other is lower for flying in tighter locations. It's a pain that you have to take the thing apart to switch the camera angles, but they do give you this screwdriver to do so. The protectors are nice and squishy, and with it being a light model, I think they're going to be pretty durable. I've already talked about the 802 22,000 kV motors, although you can now buy the model with 19,500 kV motors. The props look identical to the Gemfan 1219s, but they don't have any of the markings on them, and you are only given one set in the package. Now, I appreciate that they have spent the time to innovate this new BT2 connector, but they have still used JST plugs for the motors rather than direct soldering them to the all-in-one board, and JST plugs are another source of resistance, so I'm not sure why they have done that. Speaking of the all-in-one board, it's BetaFPV's own 5A 4-in-1 ESC and F4 flight controller. This particular one has a built-in FrSky SPI receiver, however you can get them with a multitude of different receivers including Crossfire. It's come flash with Betaflight version 3.57 and needed a fair amount of setup, so you'll need to be accustomed to Betaflight to get it in the air. I've left their PIDs the same, but the rates were completely unflyable on all of their profiles, so I changed those to my liking. The VTX is switchable via smart audio, but it only outputs 25 milliwatts, so it's a bit pointless getting the Crossfire version. They are listing the camera as the Runcam Nano 3, but I think that's a recent change because the camera in this one is definitely not the Runcam Nano 3. Then lastly, there is the canopy, which feels very brittle. I've had a couple of crashes with it, and I've been lucky that it's not split apart. So first of all, I want to cut to some footage flying inside the house. I had to put a throttle curve on it because it was just too powerful. I've got the high camera angle mount attached and it's too much of an angle to fly inside the house. It also feels really unstable in angle mode, which you can probably see. It's like flying a 2S model, and even though I'm just cruising, the voltage reaches 3.4 volts after just 38 seconds. So the BT2 connector is not going to save this LiPo. I decided that I needed to put the lower camera angle bracket on the model, but it still felt really unstable, and I'm not sure if this is going to show up on YouTube, but I'm getting the odd line of electrical noise in the video feed, and this is also causing some drift in angle mode. In fact, towards the end of the flight, it was really difficult to fly. I think BetaFPV makes some great components, but when it comes to their models, they just don't live up to the competition. Perhaps their idea for this one was to be an indoor racer, but it's the winter and I just want to fly it in my house. Now remember, I'm just cruising around here, and the longest flight time I could get was 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Okay, let's go for a line of sight with this guy, starting off in angle mode. Got cars and helicopters and everything in here. I'm having to do the line of sight indoors because we have got a storm at the moment. In fact, we've had a storm for a couple of weeks. This is really just to see what the performance is like. So let's go for a punch out. Oh, nearly hit the lights. It's amazing how much performance these little 65mm quadcopters have got on 1S these days. So flicking it into acro. Feels really smooth in here, but of course there's no breeze at all, apart from the one coming from the helicopter over there. Can't hear any flutter or anything like that, but we'll see what it's like flying at FPV. But line of sight at least, behaving quite nicely, can even do power loops. So let's try some FPV at the indoor sports hall in acro mode. Now that I've got more space, I put the high camera angle mount back on, but again, it didn't feel smooth to fly. I've got a lot of expo and the rates are set really low, but it doesn't feel like they are. And when I start doing loops and rolls, it does them okay, but I think the PIDs are set a little bit too high because I'm noticing some P-gain oscillations in the recovery of some maneuvers. I truly think that they built this thing purely for racing, but that's a niche market, and just as I suspected, the BT2 connector isn't really helping when it comes to voltage sag. It's got the power of a 2S model, but it's struggling to get a 2-minute flight time, confirming that opening the floodgates for more current draw just means shorter flight times, but you still get the voltage sag. You could try JESC, as it's been known to give longer flight times, but as I've said in my previous reviews, I like to fly products how they come out of the box, and using JESC could risk an ESC burning up. What's interesting is that the Mobula 6 has 25,000 kV motors, whereas the Meteor65 has 22,000 kV motors, and the Mobula 6 is around about the same weight as the Meteor as well, but it gets 3.5 minute flight times with a solid pin PH2 connector. So to me, that also confirms that the BT2 connector on small models like this does get rid of the bottleneck, but the LiPo still sags because its capacity is too small. So you're going to ruin your LiPo either way. So I think I'd choose the PH2 connector with solid pins over the BT2 connector at this 65mm size, because at least you get a decent flight time. Anyways, if you are interested in the Meteor65, then I'll put a link in the description of this video if you wish to get one. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.